The session for today is titled What is Really Driving Your Hospital's Utility Costs? But before we do get into that, I want to introduce myself and my colleagues. So my name is Jeff Hogan. I'm a principal here at Environ Energy, and I'll pass it over to Steve.
Yep. Good afternoon, everybody. Steve Schramm. I'm a Director of Energy Solutions here with Environ. Been here about 2 years, but in the healthcare space for the last 15.
And Oliver Hogue, Director of Energy Solutions. I've been with Environ for about 8 years and focus on bringing, all of our solutions to the table to support our clients.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. So back to the presentation for today. The focus is on why hospital utility costs move, why these movements can be difficult to explain, and ultimately how leaders of each respective facility, each respective hospital, can create a better bridge between operations, between procurement, the utility bills, the tariffs that you're on, and financial reporting. In most hospitals, utility costs are large enough to matter, but complicated enough where they may be hard to explain. A higher bill may be caused by higher usage. It may be also be caused by weather, demand charges, capacity costs, utility delivery rates, the structure of your supply contracts, or possibly a budget assumption that was not accurate in the first place. That distinction matters. If costs went up because of utility tariff change, the response is different than if a cost went up because a chiller plant created an avoidable electric peak. If costs went up because of a capacity pass-through, that is different than a broad deterioration of building energy performance. So the goal of today is to give you a practical framework for breaking utility costs apart, identifying what changed, and communicating that story in a useful way to your facilities, finance, procurement, operations, and executive leadership teams. Before we move forward in the presentation, we're going to generate a quick poll asking which energy-related challenge would you most like to learn about today? And we'd appreciate if everybody could answer that poll. Have the poll results come in? Awesome. So it looks like efficiency and infrastructure measure improvements was the leader of the pack at 45%. And we could definitely tie that to there's definitely implications for energy efficiency measures and infrastructure improvements related to how we should or how you should approach budgeting. But ultimately, I think that's captured within this presentation. So ultimately, what we want everybody to be able to do by the end of today's session is kind of described on the slide here and broken down into four categories. So first, we want to provide you the opportunity to be able to identify the primary components that drive a hospital's electric and natural gas costs. That includes supply, delivery, demand, capacity, transmission, tariffs, riders, taxes. There's a lot that goes into the individual bill components, and we're going to talk about that a little bit further on. Second, we want to be able to distinguish between the cost changes caused by operations and usage, and then cost changes that are caused by market, weather, tariffs, the utility rates, or procurement decisions. We find that distinction to be one of the most important ideas throughout this presentation. The facilities teams should not be blamed for a tariff change, and the market should not be blamed for an unmanaged operational peak. Third, we want to be able to evaluate whether utility budget and procurement assumptions actually reflect the way in which that your facilities operate. That means looking at your current contracts, rate structures, operating schedules, demand profiles, your cogeneration plants if you have them, your central plants, any planned projects. So again, tying that back to the efficiency measures, and known load changes. Lastly, and not least, we want to be able to provide you a way to develop a repeatable variance process. The goal is not just to explain a bill after the fact. The goal is to create a cadence that helps facilities teams identify risk earlier, communicate that more clearly, and take action before the same issue shows up again next year or next month. The webinar itself is going to move in five-ish parts. We're going to start with why costs move, break down the anatomy of a bill. From there, we'll look at the market, tariff, and procurement drivers. And then we plan to walk through a variance framework. Finally, we will close with a suggested governance cadence that we hope facilities teams can use on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis. The theme across all five sections is the utility bill should be treated as a management tool and not just an accounting record. So why does this topic matter now? And we feel that it's more relevant now more than ever. Generally speaking, hospitals are under pretty hefty and significant financial pressure. As shown on the slide here, hospital expense growth is outpacing hospital price growth. That means that health systems are being asked to manage rising costs while still protecting staffing, clinical operations, infrastructure reliability, patient safety, and ultimately long-term capital needs. Utility expenses are one of the major cost categories that facilities teams can and in fact do influence. But they can only manage and explain those costs effectively if the organization has the right level of cost granularity, cost decomposition, depending upon how you want to frame it. If we all know that the utility bill increased, but we may not know yet what happened. It may be usage, it may be weather, it may be demand, it may be the supply contract, it may be a delivery rate, it may be a change in your capacity or transmission charge. Or again, ultimately that original budgeted assumption was too simplistic for the way that the hospital operates. That is why the question on this slide is ultimately very important. Did we use more energy, or did the energy we use become more expensive? There's a better way than simply asking why are utilities up. It forces us to separate out the volume, price, demand, tariff, all of the different bill components that we've talked about, and ultimately operational behavior. Once we separate those drivers, we can have a more productive discussion about what's controllable, what is inherited, and what actions should follow. So this slide is ultimately looking to accomplish why does it feel harder to forecast? And what we're seeing here is that in many of the parts of the country, electricity demand is growing. We're seeing that in the news. We're seeing that in likely energy, market updates that are being provided to you by your teams. Capacity and transmission costs are becoming a visible component in customer budgets, whereas previously they were, to some extent, a negligible cost. Natural gas prices are still sensitive to storage, production, LNG exports, power sector demand, and weather. At the same time, hospitals have complex load profiles and limited operational flexibility. So changes in the market can show up in your budgets very quickly. One of the most important themes right now is that the market is not moving uniformly across different regions. Some regions are seeing softer forward prices because of natural gas weakness, weather expectations, or additions of solar and storage, different energy resources. Other regions continue to face tighter capacity conditions, slower infrastructure additions, or transmission constraints. The national market story is no longer a simple one. Regional conditions really do matter. Natural gas is also sending a mixed signal. Near-term prices may face downward pressure from very healthy storage, production, and the possibility of a mild winter. But the longer-term risk is still there and needs to be factored in to your processes. LNG demand, data center growth, power sector demand can still create upside risk or bullish pressure in the outer years. For facilities teams, the practical takeaway is that budget risk increasingly comes from multiple sources: commodity markets, delivery rates, demand charges, capacity obligations, your procurement structure, and the operational load shape, and how that shape fits into those forward market prices. A simple escalation factor may not just be enough to accommodate year-over-year budget change. If the budget does not separately account for usage, demand, and all these different bill components, then normal cost behavior can look like poor performance. So as we move into the rest of the presentation, keep this in mind. The goal is not a perfect prediction. The goal is better attribution. If we can explain what changed and why, we can make better decisions about operations, procurement, projects, and budgets. I will say before I pass it off to my colleague that if you have any questions, feel free to throw those into the chat, and we'll look to address those now or towards the end of the webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff has already discussed, a monthly utility bill is far more than just one individual cost. There's many components that make up the overall charge, as well as how these different components move over time from an operational perspective or a market perspective are going to affect your overall cost. So when judging performance of your utility costs or expenditure, it's very important to break these down and compartmentalize them so you can understand, the variance and where you're seeing the shift or change. From a consumption perspective, yes, you can relate it to your historical volumes, but it's very important to also understand the space utilization within the hospital, as well as any potential equipment coming online, delivery and taxes. Did your rate class change? Was there a restructuring in the allocation of size with the utility? Or perhaps there was a missed tax exemption, which is dragging up the overall price per kWh. Operations and weather, you might have downtime for a cogeneration unit or something like that, which has decreased your natural gas consumption, but then pushed up the electric price. Or we went through, January or February, that weather where the majority of the country didn't go above freezing for about a 2-week period. So was weather normalization incorporated into the overall cost and factored into why you saw that spike? Supply and market changes are going to vary drastically depending on the strategy, which one would employ, whether you have a fixed price or floating. As I mentioned, the winter we had last winter, the spot market gas price went to $7.50, which would have been a key contributor to the increase in price that we would have seen last winter. And demand and capacity, as most of you would be aware of, in certain ISOs, the cost for capacity and transmission has increased exponentially over the last couple of years, which is driving a significant portion of the overall utility budget. So in order to better understand, where your cost increases or decreases are coming from, it's important to separate out all these different cost components. Focusing specifically on electricity, the electric rate, as we've just sort of broken out from a utility perspective, is also made up of a number of different components. Historically, the energy supply component has been the largest, but capacity and transmission have increased substantially, as mentioned, over the last few years. You have your distribution and delivery through the local utility, and then some additional riders, ancillaries, and clean energy charges. In order to answer questions appropriately and portray the appropriate picture to your finance or other stakeholders that are interested in evaluating or looking at this expense, it's also important, to break these components down individually. To better understand this, you can apply a percentage to each individual component, and then from there, you can understand what has shifted from a budget variance perspective. One example that we have here is we have a partner, a client, that their finance team was questioning what was going on with their electric budget and the performance of the overall hedging program. Was it effective or was it not? And it was getting a little bit of scrutiny. And when we actually broke this down into a percentage and how those have moved for year over year, it was realized that the energy supply component through the hedge program was actually performing very well and was managed down year over year, but the large increase was coming from the capacity and transmission components. So understanding that enabled the facilities team and the finance team to ask the question, well, how can we control these additional components, which are more based around demand instead of usage? And in this case, they've now started to explore the different opportunities to reduce capacity and transmission tags through peak load shaving, energy efficiency, cogen batteries, and really turning over every rock to achieve these cost reductions within these specific components. Delivery and tariff changes, these can always and should always be evaluated, probably on a biannual, at the very least, basis to ensure that the appropriate rate structures are always in place. From a natural gas perspective, the majority of us would be very familiar with NYMEX, Henry Hub, or spot market gas, right? Henry Hub is the largest natural gas exchange in the world, and it's typically what gets the most attention from a natural gas budget or what you're hedging. The other critical component to the two delivery pieces is basis. Basis is the delivery, so it's securing the pipeline capacity cost for the overall gas delivered from NYMEX. Basis can shift pretty substantially in price from one year to the next. Typically, you do hedge this price or lock it all in one go, but it can be managed as well from hedging in tranches or from a diversified approach. The main things contributing to basis cost movement would be pipeline developments and the available capacity on the pipeline that's feeding the territory in which you are operating in. So being mindful of those changes is very important to managing the basis cost more appropriately. Delivery and transport, this is from the utility side, so it's not something that you're going to have as much control over. But understanding what those rates and tariffs are critical to formulating an effective budget. The one area that I want to draw or emphasize is the service class, firm, interruptible, dual fuels. So in recent years, due to the pipeline constraints, there's been more and more emphasis placed on whether you are on a firm or an interruptible rate class. And if you're on an interruptible rate class, this means that the utility or the supplier can call upon you in the winter as an operational flow order and ask you to either curtail usage or shift to a dual fuel. And this past winter, there were significant impacts if you're on an interruptible rate class and you weren't able to either shift fuels or curtail to the tune of several $100,000 for individual days. Firm is where they cannot call upon you to curtail your load or shift fuels. So dependent on how you're structured internally and if you have the resources to curtail or shift load to dual fuel boiler or something like that, there can be significant cost impacts that come along with that rate service. From a firm perspective, it's probably going to increase your overall cost by about $1 per decatherm. So if you have the ability to move to an interruptible rate class and the resources and facilities to execute when you're called upon, that can drastically lower your price. But if you do move to that interruptible rate class and you're not able to curtail or shift load, the impacts can be substantial. The other thing to consider here is, does the utility have the available capacity within that pipeline to shift you over to a firm service if you'd like to move in the other direction? And that process can take upwards of a couple of months to receive the information directly from the utility. Anything to add, Jeff?
No. I think that was a great description. I think that again, just looking at the kind of the forward markets and where markets are right now, there is always kind of a cost arbitrage opportunity if you have gas and potentially the ability to switch. But that is an interesting dynamic to consider for the upcoming winter, given that we've seen a pretty significant increase in heating oil prices, while gas is down. So it's always a moving target. But again, if you have a repeatable process to understand and make that decision, conduct that analysis, I think it leads to better market outcomes.
So the question comes, what can you control and what's inherited? From a facilities perspective, there's a number of things that you can implement to control your costs, and other things that may have been passed down perhaps from a previous employee or been in place for a number of years. On the first example here, operating schedules, there is an ability to either sequence or schedule timing for certain equipments. From a healthcare perspective, it can become difficult because you have to provide, the facility with the exact set points that you need to. But you can look at peak demand management to potentially shift some loads that may be able to be moved. Equipment performance, making sure that everything is operating at its intended efficiency, which ties into continuous commissioning or improvements. There's other things that are totally out of your control, like the commodity price perhaps from a past contract, the utility tariffs as they change, and the capacity and transmission tags as we've moved through different market prices over the last couple of years, specifically within the PJM market. And then finally, the contract structure, dependent on if you're on a fixed product, the layered index is going to be outside of the control of the overall facilities team. And it's important not to blame operations on tariff changes or to blame the market for unmanaged peak or energy efficiency. When we talk about the different procurement structures, it's important not to always just look at the lowest price, because there's a lot of risk that's involved or can be taken on dependent on the product or structure that you look to employ. And when we're evaluating this, we believe it's important to either create an energy committee or at the very least incorporate finance into the decision, so that way you can understand what budget variance would be acceptable and how much risk the organization can wear. And once you've had those conversations, it can really help guide and inform the appropriate strategy that should be adopted by the system. A fully fixed contract can bring an incredible amount of budget certainty. However, there's often premiums that are included in that product structure, as well as you can often leave money in the market that you could have avoided. We have a client that procured a long-term contract before we partnered that was 100% fixed for the gas side. And within the recent market developments, over the last year in gas trading at $3 on the spot or $3.50 in the futures market, they're overhedged by about $1.50. So by fixing it all in one go, it actually limits your ability to be flexible and potentially achieve or blend down that rate over time. On the other side, you have floating the supply contract or floating it on the index market. Typically over time, that can be very effective. However, on a monthly basis, there would be a huge deviation in the overall price. As I mentioned earlier, the price in January or February was up to $7.50, and then in May it was down below $3. So if your finance team can weather that and you're okay with wearing that risk, it can be an effective strategy, but there's really no control. You're really sort of rolling the dice. The product structure that we find most effective is a managed contract with layered hedging, and that's hedging over time in tranches, perhaps 10 to 20%. And you can do that and still achieve a fixed position, but by diversifying the market the timing, you're eliminating market timing risk. And hopefully, or the strategy would be to buy down that rate in tranches over time. Dependent on the location, you can also look to place seasonal hedges in the winter. As you know, the spot market for gas typically spikes every winter and then lowers as we go to the shoulder seasons and through the summer. So by separating out, the hedges as well as the seasons, you can often come up with, an effective strategy to have a certain amount of budget certainty, but also allow for flexibility in the event that there are market changes that you want to capitalize on. So we've talked about the price. The other key component to evaluating proposals is the different components or structure within the contract terms. And this can affect the price substantially. So what components are included? As we've talked through, there's energy, capacity and transmission, line losses, delivery taxes. All of these can either be included in a contract price or passed through. Commonly, the components that are passed through are capacity and transmission. And if these aren't accounted for appropriately when formulating your budgets, it can significantly impact the overall delivery price when you're receiving your utility bill. So understanding what components are included in that overall cost is critical. And if they are fixed or passed through, how would that affect your longer term price from a price perspective, but also from an operational perspective? If you fixed your capacity or transmission or your demand-based charges and you're implementing efficiency or your different or other projects to lower your demand or usage, you won't actually realize that gain if you fix them. So often passing them through is the appropriate strategy in contracts. Load assumptions. Gas is a little bit more strict as it relates to load assumptions. If you're overhedging or underhedging, you have to either purchase or resell that gas on the spot market. So understanding what that resale value is, as well as if you're putting CHP or electrification, how that in turn is going to affect your electric or gas budget. And finally, from an operational perspective, if you're closing things, expanding, or you're implementing different projects, how that is going to affect the overall contract. Can you incorporate, add, or delete language to the contract? Or if not, what are these potential penalties to either exit or change your usage volumes within the contract term?
All right, I think this is me. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Jeff. So we've talked a lot now. Oliver just went through kind of the supply component. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about those demand-based charges that Oliver was just mentioning. So when you think of tariff, I want you to think of it as the official rule book that guides kind of the rate schedule that that you would pay. So all the items here listed on screen are some of those different elements. The first being demand charges. Depending on which ISO you're in, you would have something called a coincident peak, commonly referred to as a CP event. In ISO New England, it's a bit different than ISO New York, then different than PJM. So managing your single peak is when your hospital consumes the most amount of power. When we call it a coincident peak, it's when your hospital consumes the most amount of power that when the grid is at its most strained or the most consumption is being applied to the grid. So when we look at managing your demand charge, we're looking at reducing your coincident peak so that you don't have a demand-based charge that carries forward to the next year. If you have the ability to reduce your usage during coincident peaks, that's what demand-based charges are. A ratchet is a mechanism for your minimum base charge. So if you had maybe a hospital uses 4,000 kW and your normal usage is 3,000 kW, a ratchet would then apply, like an 80% ratchet would be a tariff. So you'd be at 3,200 kW and you may be paying for more electricity than you're actually consuming. Time of use is peak, off peak, it's when the hospital is consuming energy. Depending on the tariff, you have a different rate class for the time of use. Riders and charges are on your utility bill. They make up whether you have renewable energy charges or transportation charges. That's something you want to separate out your those components that you would pass through when you're looking at a budget. And then your rate class, determining if you are actually on the right rate class depending on your load consumption.
I will just add in here that the analysis of this level of granularity can prove to be beneficial to your organization. Um, Contract demand, we have an example of a customer recently who we did a contract demand analysis for them. It was a gas account where that contract demand was set on the peak hourly consumption uh, over an annual period. And they were getting overcharged by around $100,000 a year. And the analysis was relatively simple. Pull the interval data, conduct the analysis, suggest and reach out to the utility to provide them that analysis. They agreed, the change was made. And there's probably a lot of those opportunities that are out there. And similarly for contract demands, a lot of large electrical services will also have contract demand. If you have on-site generation, if you're producing it through on-site, the utility needs to know how much energy it's going to need to provide to you. So adjusting that or an implication of that, again, a use case is a customer has a cogen plant that has an unexpected outage. And their standby services are going to pick up the load, the kilowatt hours that are not being generated on site, and their contract demand charges are likely to come into play or be impacted negatively into the future if they don't understand the operational decisions and what they mean in the context of their utility invoice.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so looking at a monthly bill, I would like you to kind of think of it this way. Your monthly kWh is the amount of electricity you consume for that month. Your monthly peak is how much you're consuming right now in any given moment. So if you use the car analogy, your monthly kWh is how long you're driving or distance of your travel. Your monthly peak kW is how fast you're going. And then your 15-minute interval data is looking at every 15 minutes how your energy is being consumed and where it's being consumed. So when we look at this, we want to determine, am I using more electricity because of a weather-related event, or am I running several chillers, pumps, and HVAC equipment all at the same time? So looking at that interval level data will help you determine that. And then again, are you consuming your most amount of energy within your hospital during a coincident peak when the grid is at its most strained? And then lastly, if you're looking at doing an energy efficiency project, are you just reducing the kWh, the amount of electrons you're using in that particular month, or are you actually reducing your peak when you're using the how much electricity you're consuming at any given point in time? And that's where we would look to potentially load shift. If you can shift to running your CHP harder or battery storage or other alternatives for reducing your actual peak. Jeff, anything to add there?
Um, I think I would just add, I mean, from when we're talking about load management, maximizing the value of the assets that you have on site. Sometimes a hospital is max. Maybe this summer, like you might have barely met the cooling need. But if you do have hybrid plants, chiller plants with assets of different vintages from different years, they all have different efficiencies. And if you haven't looked at the way in which that you can sequence those operations to achieve in the most efficient manner that peak load, there are ways that you can kind of flatten that load profile. So jumping to the next slide, to potentially have, which may have an impact on your utility bills, not only from the delivery of supply, even if you're at a regulated market, demand is still a significant portion of that cost.
Yeah. And I think the question that all facilities managers and VPs want to know is what caused my peak event? Was it equipment sequencing? Equipment sequencing? Was it a weather-related event? Oliver talked about Winter Storm Fern, when much of the country was freezing and gas prices increased. So it really, do you have to then increase your electricity usage throughout the facility? So identifying what's actually causing that peak demand event is very important. And that's where the interval data can help you. And then lastly here, the budget. So your budget is not just what your supply cost is and what your delivery cost is. You have tariffs, all the riders, surcharges, and fees that drive those demand-based charges. You have weather. So when you're putting together a budget, you need to consider all of these different factors here. Your infrastructure, your assets, your operations, how everything blends together in order to really kind of stress test your budget. Did you come in under budget? Was there a particular reason or driver behind that, or did you come in over budget? So you really need to kind of look at all of these different factors together to help manage your total energy costs.
I will just add here before we go to the next slide that we see often within our client portfolio a very different approach to developing budgets. Some look at just applying a particular rate across historical performance. Some may just take the rolling 12 of what your cost was. Both have their strengths and weaknesses. But as we kind of associate this back to the variability and volatility in energy markets, all of those approaches have deficiencies in that they are not projecting out what the facility is going to perform or how the facility is going to perform into the future. So again, you could think for 2026, if you took a rolling 12 or maybe the historical averages, for January and February for most of the United States, your cost likely far surpassed that in 2026 just due to where markets were. Again, it's very explainable because it's fundamentally weather driven. But if you took a bit more of a detailed approach into projecting that cost, it could have given you a better budgetary methodology. I think everybody wants to be close. But ultimately, it would perform, it's a more repeatable process and giving you a better output. If we then start to talk about that variance process, that variance method, there is, I think, a sequence that we could ultimately follow, which we've described on the screen here. So the things that can impact your bills are kind of in the middle: weather, usage, demand, tariff, supply. We have the budgeted number in this kind of simplistic example. The budgeted value is $100,000. The actual invoice total is 160. But if we follow a repeatable process that looks at these individual cost components, we can understand what was the thing that really drove this increase. And across, again, this simplistic example, it was a little bit of everything. But by doing so, it allows you to explain why an invoice came in $60,000 above what we budgeted for. And we can normalize for weather. We can understand the usage patterns. We can understand that maybe this was a summer period and demand was far greater than we expected. You may have had a change in your tariff or maybe an additional clean energy standard component or renewable energy charge. And hotter weather resulted in higher supply cost for the organization. And I think by doing this and following this process, you're able to kind of provide your finance teams, the leadership teams, even from your teams, a very thorough analysis of what happened and ultimately what can we do, if anything, to be able to address this in the future or adjust the process to explain this better. So I think this is me, Oliver and Steve. I pulled up the wrong notes, but I'm going to jump into this. And I want to tie this back to one of the things that the attendees noted as being of importance to them, which was energy as a service. All of this in this process is something that you're going to have to go through if you are seriously considering energy as a service, specifically the development of your utility baseline. That will be weather normalized. It will be adjusted for historical consumption. Um, and these are things that I would imagine everybody does have access to, but a utility data set in some form or format, be it Excel, some type of software tool, it shouldn't necessarily live in just accounts payable or something to that effect. The bills give you the information you need to understand your facility at the depth that we believe is required to enable really solid and sound decision making. So that includes all of your billing data. We've seen customers that have a 20-year history, and we've seen, due to changes in whatnot in personnel, they don't have any utility data history. Understanding what accounts serve what sounds simple, but for large sprawling campuses, that may be a challenge. But being able to tie out an account and a meter to a specific load or to a specific building can help you understand the way in which that account serves that building. The supply and delivery separation, sometimes that's on one invoice, sometimes that's on two different invoices. But what is the cost and what are the cost components to each of those? And again, the taxes, riders, and late fees hopefully aren't a problem. But if they are, digging into this may help you to understand what is causing those internally. Interval data is very helpful when looking at how your facility performs. Interval data is typically a real-time available asset or resource to most through your utilities or through other systems. Billing data is kind of a lagging indicator. You don't really know how you performed until you get your report card. But the interval data, if available to you, can give you some real-time performance, especially if you're looking at peak load shaving in real time. It can be very helpful to understand if I turn this chiller on, if I turn these pumps on, what happens in the morning or during the afternoon, I should say. From a contract and tariff perspective, it is good to have access to those documents, to the contracts, to what the terms are, how long is the contract, what is the contract structure, are all of my accounts included in that contract? The treatment of capacity and transmission. Again, this has become a significant portion of a lot of our customers' invoices. There's use cases recently, in New York specifically. In the month of May, we saw a historical cost per kW for capacity, resulting in a lot of questions. But again, if they followed our suggested process for budget development, then you would have budgeted for a particular capacity cost, and you can show what happened and why. And it's very explainable. And you could also then look into the forward market to say, is this going to continue, and what can we do to control it? Demand response is something that we feel a lot of organizations participate in. So how you participate, what the financial obligations are, does that need to be factored into your budget? Where does that check go? And then ultimately, just your budgeted assumptions. Ultimately, what are we projecting from a heating degree day and cooling degree day perspective, if you want to get to that level of granularity? Occupancy can be a relevant data point. You could look to correlate potentially patient days to energy use to see if there is some type of correlation through a regression analysis. Any of the known projects, are you installing a combined heat and power plant? Are you installing cogen? Are you taking a steam chiller to an electric chiller? Knowing when those things happen will have material impacts on your utilities and should be factored into your overall budget. And then operating schedules and any exceptions. Again, most acute care facilities are 8760 operating year round, but hospitals aren't only acute care hospitals. You have medical office buildings, outside buildings that are still material energy consumers, and those an ambulatory care center, for instance, will have a significantly different operating profile, and we should understand that when we're developing that budget.
Okay, so I think one of the poll questions kind of leaned a little bit towards this particular side. So, will an efficiency project reduce the charges driving the bill? I think the answer to that, right, is it can increase and decrease it dependent on the potential project that you're looking to implement. If you're electrifying, obviously you're going to be shifting a little bit of the cost from natural gas over to power, or if you're looking at cogen, the cost is going to shift from electricity to gas as it's fueling the cogeneration unit. One of the key recommendations here is ensuring that the engineering analysis matches the rate structure and the procurement assumptions. So best practice, model projections against actual tariffs and procurement contracts, not generic blended kWh or therm values. We often see when projects are getting modeled out that they're comparing it to a generic rate, which might be higher or lower than the actual procurement contract that you may have in place, as well as the assumption that the utility expense might escalate at a 2.9% increase year over year, which can drastically shift the economics of a project one way or the other. So ensuring that you're aligning it with your actual procurement contracts or tariffs is critical to modeling out a project and making sure that it's the ROI is accurate and everything is in place. The other thing to consider here is how it's going to actually impact the overall bill. Whether you're looking to achieve usage reductions in the form of kWh or demand reductions, kW. And if you are looking to influence those demand-based charges, how are you then sequencing or prioritizing that equipment over time to capitalize on either the lower peaks or your CP days? With a boiler replacement, if you're at a single fuel source boiler and you can shift or perhaps implement a project with a dual fuel source, you could actually look at shifting your rate classes, your service class from firm to interruptible, which can have a substantial decrease in the overall cost. So making sure that all these things are considered when you're modeling out the project. Combined heat and power and cogen. One of the primary things here, which will contribute to the sort of the go or no go for a project, is the spark spread, which is what it costs to produce a kWh of power from a decatherm of gas. And if you have your costs even off slightly with either what you're expected to purchase that gas for or what your power is forecasted at, it's going to, again, substantially shift the economics of your overall project. With CHP, combined heat and power, part of the value of that is recapturing the thermal loss from the engine and reutilizing that for another part of your facility or perhaps creating steam. So dependent on how you can reutilize that thermal energy would sort of lean you towards one project or the other, and then also have an impact on perhaps your steam costs or there's other things impacting your bills. One of the big things here, which can have a substantial impact on the demand, especially with the recent changes with the capacity markets across the country, is batteries and thermal storage. So batteries have become very cost effective compared to where they were 5-10 years ago. And there's even structures where certain vendors will put all of this equipment in or the battery storage at no capital expenditure and then present a shared savings model from what can be achieved from the reductions in demand. So, not only can that enable participation in sort of peak load management, but also demand response. As the grid continues to experience major capacity constraints, the cost for these programs for demand response has increased. So, thermal storage and battery storage should be considered, when looking to reduce your demand. From a kWh perspective, battery storage or thermal storage is going to have more of a limited impact. It's more so based around kW. And then finally, electrification. As organizations, hospitals, systems, grids look to decarbonize, electrification, moving forward into the future is going to become a real thing. And unfortunately, some pieces of equipment can't run as efficiently from power as they can from gas. So, making sure that those assumptions are all factored in appropriately is critical, as well as if you do electrify, do you have the appropriate power delivery on site to support that electrification? And how is it not only going to affect the kWh, but there's capacity and there's different rate classes as you move forward. So efficiency projects can have a very positive impact on your delivery charges as long as things are modeled appropriately and it's a targeted approach to figure out if you're going to target a usage reduction or demand.
So
I think this one's you.
thanks, Steve. So building the repeatable utility budget and variance process kind of ties back to again a consistent theme here, where we're collecting information, collecting bills, collecting all the different data components within those invoices. We want to then normalize that data. Was whether the driver was that bill an additional day, additional 3 days, then attribute analyze that data to attribute the cause. Was it usage, demand, rate, procurement, weather, or was it project related? Act on that information, that analysis. So if it's some type of operational fix that can be employed to try to do that, if there are procurement changes to make, that you then communicate that through the necessary channels. If you think that there's something wrong with the tariff, to address that. Again, we gave use cases of reaching out to the utility with the right data points to get you into the right tariff for future savings potentially, or to measure and verify what the project is actually going to save from a demand or a consumption perspective. And then finally, and potentially most importantly, is creating a finance or executive leadership ready variance summary, and who owns the actions that were discussed in step 4. The cadence that we would ultimately suggest is collecting this data on at least a monthly basis, to do a periodic review, quarterly review of procurement and tariff information for your utilities. And then annually, right around now is when most of our clients who are on a calendar year cycle are developing their budget assumptions and their budget model to project things for this upcoming year. So we want to again kind of give an example of what translating this utility complexity into something simple. Whenever we're delivering messages or when I was delivering messages to my boss, it's always, keep it simple, keep it 3 bullet points. And that's what we could ultimately try to do with something that is a modestly complicated message. So what changed? Why? What can we control? And what that action is. And a finance ready variance summary should include all the things listed here. I'm going to jump to the next slide just to give an example and given where we are with time. So an example, and again, this is a hypothetical example, but if a hospital missed the budget, now what? So, the finance team asks, why did we miss the utility budget by 12%? The facilities team conducts their analysis and state that consumption was only 2% higher after we weather normalized the data. The procurement team finds, or the facilities team finds, that the capacity and delivery pass-throughs increased more than we budgeted. And then operations identifies that a chiller staging issue drove high demand days during a bill period. So the executive answer to, again, why did we miss the utility budget by 12% would be, as explained here, the cost increase primarily from rate and tariff drivers, not a broad deterioration of facility energy performance. A small controllable portion came from demand peaks tied to chiller sequencing, which facilities is correcting before the summer peak period. Simple, effective, actionable, and executive ready.
Okay, given the time, I'm kind of going to run through this real quickly, but we put together 5 questions that any facilities manager should ask themselves or their teams every single month. I think the main driver and the main theme from the beginning of this presentation was like the u utility bill is a management tool. It's not just an accounting record. It's not something you just file in your filing cabinet or keep digitally and you just don't look at it. You just pay the bill and you say, oh, all right, my cost for August of 26 is less than 25. I'm happy with that. You really need to kind of look at it from a three-dimensional view. One, did we use more energy this month? And what is the driver behind that? Did we peak differently? And again, what was the driver behind that? Did our tariffs and rate change? Did our load change that maybe allows us to be on a more favorable rate class? Did our procurement strategy operate as expected? Did we come in above the mark, below the mark? Did we buy enough gas or electricity for that particular month or for what we're going into for the next season? And what is the action? What's the next steps behind that? These are questions that should be had every single month, not just once a quarter or when budgets are due for being submitted. And where we can help, where an advisor can help without taking over the full responsibility of the decision. An advisor is here to be your partner and guide you through all of these questions and all these decision points without actually taking full ownership of them. So here are just a few things where we can provide assistance. One being utility data management, so making sure all your accounts are mapped properly and looking at that interval data, looking at the bill validation, making sure there are no overcharges, making sure you're on the right rate class, et cetera, which then leads into the next one of tariff and rate analysis, looking at all of those demand-based charges, making sure everything is accurate. Project economics, making sure that your savings is actually accounted for and tied to what you expect them to be. Procurement strategy, like Oliver had talked about, managing the commodity itself. So that's the natural gas and the electricity. And then budget and variance reporting. Are we on track for our budget? Did we come in above or below? What is the variance there? What are the drivers behind that variance? Is it on the demand side? Is it on the supply side? So looking at all those things. But all of that data together will allow you to make better, more informed decisions. Key takeaways. Yeah. So total utility cost is a living, breathing thing. It's not one singular performance. It's not just the number you see on your utility bill. It's a result of all the decisions you've made up until that point. Demand capacity tariffs and contract structure can move budgets even when you hit the mark and your forecasted volumes for that month were exactly what you consumed. Still, the cost can change there. Again, looking at the variance analysis to make sure what caused you to be off the mark or miss the mark there. And then procurement is not just a singular event. It's not just a bid event. It's not just a transaction. It's a risk management process. It needs to be fully vetted and have multiple people looking at this to make sure it's effective and it's the right decision for the organization. And then lastly, I think the theme of this is when we have all this data together, combined with the facilities team, the finance team, maybe an advisor to drive the right decisions and make sure you're looking at things for the best possible outcome for the facility. I think that's it.
And that is all that we had for today. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw those into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer those.
I did see one Q&A. Yes, this presentation will be made available after.
All right. It doesn't seem like we have any questions coming in. Hopefully that means our presentation answered all of the questions that you may or may not have. But this deck and the presentation will be available. If you do have any questions about anything that was shared here or would like to pick up and further this conversation, our contact is on the screen for you to use or to engage with. So we greatly appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for giving us an hour of your very busy schedules. Hopefully there was some good tidbits in here to take back to your respective teams. And we hope everybody has a great rest of the week.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.